The sky above the Ural Mountains has always seemed too high for war. On the morning of May 1, 1960, that comforting illusion ended in a single orange flash at 70,500 feet. A Lockheed reconnaissance aircraft, painted in dark sea blue to fade against the stratosphere, flying so high that no Soviet fighter could touch it, suddenly pitched forward and broke apart over a ploughed field near the village of Kosulino in Sverdlovsk Oblast. The pilot was 30 years old, an American civilian on contract to the Central Intelligence Agency, and his name was Francis Gary Powers. Within hours, his capture would humiliate a presidency, collapse a four-power summit in Paris, and end an era of espionage that both Washington and Moscow had silently agreed to pretend was not happening. But before any of that political wreckage settled, there was the moment itself, the 4 minutes of confusion in a Soviet command bunker, the radar operators staring at a green target that finally, after 3 years of escaping every Soviet attempt to reach it, was falling out of their sky. This is the story of what those operators saw, what they fired, what they hit, and what they accidentally killed. To understand the magnitude of that morning, you have to understand what the United States had been doing for nearly 4 years. Beginning in July 1956, American intelligence had been flying an aircraft so unusual that the Soviets at first refused to believe it existed. Designed by Clarence Johnson at the Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California, the U-2 was essentially a powered glider strapped to a single Pratt & Whitney J-75 turbojet. Its wings were enormously long and thin, like those of a sailplane. Its body was so light that the airframe was stressed for only 2.5 times the force of gravity, less than half what an ordinary fighter could endure. It carried no weapons. It carried no markings. What it did carry was a camera. The Hycon B camera, designed by the Harvard astronomer James Baker with optics ground by the Perkin-Elmer Corporation, could resolve an object 2.5 feet across from 65,000 feet in the air. From the edge of the stratosphere, it could photograph a parked truck, count the missiles on a launch pad, and measure the runway of an airfield. And the U-2 could fly higher than anything in the Soviet inventory. The man who had pushed the program through against deep institutional resistance was President Dwight Eisenhower. He had not wanted to authorize overflights of a sovereign nation in peacetime. He understood, with a clarity that haunted him, that if one of these aircraft were ever shot down inside the Soviet Union, the consequences would be catastrophic. He told his aides that such an event would, in his words, be on his head. He preferred a different solution. At the Geneva summit on July 21, 1955, he had proposed something he called open skies, a mutual agreement under which the United States and the Soviet Union would each permit the other to conduct aerial inspection of its territory. Premier Nikita Khrushchev rejected the proposal almost immediately, calling it a transparent espionage plot. So Eisenhower, reluctantly, authorized the flights one at a time, personally signing off on every single penetration of Soviet airspace. The strategic stakes were not abstract. Through the late 1950s, American intelligence was gripped by 2 terrors. The first was the so-called bomber gap, the fear that the Soviet long-range bomber fleet was vastly larger than the American one. The second was the missile gap, the fear that Moscow was racing ahead in intercontinental ballistic missiles. U-2 photography, mission after mission, dismantled the bomber gap within months. The fleet of Soviet heavy bombers, estimated by some American analysts at 600 to 800 aircraft, turned out to number perhaps 150. The missile gap was harder to resolve, because the launch sites were buried deep inside Soviet territory, far from any border. Reaching them required flying directly across the country. Reaching them was, for now, the only way to know. The Soviets understood within hours of the first overflight that they were being photographed. Soviet radar had detected the very first U-2 penetration, flown by a pilot named Hervey Stockman from a base in West Germany on July 4, 1956. The Soviet protest reached the State Department within the week. What the Soviets could not do was anything about it. The fastest interceptors in the Soviet inventory, the MiG-15 and the MiG-17, reached their absolute service ceiling at around 54,000 feet. The U-2 cruised at 70,000. There was a vertical gap of 3 miles between hunter and prey, and that gap might as well have been the surface of the moon. Soviet pilots described pushing their aircraft into stalls and watching the contrail of the American intruder pass serenely overhead, untouchable, impudent, and gone. This was the first hidden flaw in the American achievement, though it was a flaw of a different kind. Not a flaw in the aircraft, a flaw in the assumption. American planners had convinced themselves that because the U-2 could not be intercepted, it could not be detected. The two were treated as the same fact. They were not. Every overflight was tracked. Every overflight was logged. Every overflight deepened the rage of a Soviet leader who understood that his country was being inspected against its will and who could do absolutely nothing about it. The consequences of that miscalculation accumulated quietly through the second half of the 1950s. Khrushchev raged at his air defense generals. He threw quotas, deadlines, and threats at his aircraft industry. He poured resources into surface-to-air missile development. He told Marshal Sergei Beryuzov, the commander of the Air Defense Forces, that the next overflight had to be the last. Beryuzov reportedly answered that if he could become a missile himself, he would fly into the intruder personally. The remark was meant as gallows humor. It was also meant as a confession. The Soviet leadership understood, by 1959, that solving this problem with conventional fighters was impossible. They needed a new weapon. They needed a missile that could reach into the stratosphere and pull the American aircraft down by force. Sound, as the saying goes, travels through water. Radar travels through air. And once the Soviets accepted that they would never outclimb the U-2, they began to build a system that did not need to climb at all. The system would wait on the ground, tracked by radar, fired by computer, and would punish anything that crossed into its envelope. Whoever built that system first would change the nature of aerial reconnaissance forever. The race had moved underground, into design bureaus and missile factories. And no one in Washington fully understood how close the Soviets had come. The protagonist of what follows is not Francis Gary Powers, although he is the man who fell. The protagonist is the unevenly developed, scandalously embarrassed, ferociously determined Soviet air defense system, called in Russian the Voiska Protivovozdushnoi Oborony Strany, the anti-air defense forces of the country. Known by the acronym PVO, this branch of the Soviet military had been formed as a separate service only in May 1954. By 1960, it ranked third in the Soviet order of battle, behind only the strategic rocket forces and the ground forces. Its commander was a deputy minister of defense. Its mission was to ensure that no foreign aircraft ever again crossed Soviet airspace with impunity, as the German Luftwaffe had done in 1941 and as the American U-2s were doing now. PVO entered the U-2 crisis from a position of profound inferiority. Soviet metallurgy lagged behind American standards. Soviet electronics were heavier, less reliable, and less precise. Soviet aircraft engines could not match the thrust-to-weight ratios of their American counterparts. The Sukhoi Design Bureau had pushed the new Su-9 interceptor to a service ceiling of around 55,000 feet, still short of the U-2 by another 15,000 feet of vertical air. The MiG-19, a transonic fighter that had only recently entered widespread service, was no better. Even when one of these aircraft did manage to come within visual range of a U-2, its weapons could not reach it. The encounter ended with the Soviet pilot watching the American disappear into the haze. The Soviet answer to this geometric impossibility was the S-75 Dvina, a surface-to-air missile system that the Western Alliance would designate by the code name SA-2 guideline. Its development had been authorized by a Council of Ministers decree in November 1953, supervised by Chief Designer Pyotr Grushin at the Missile Design Bureau in Khimki, and paired with a fire control radar designed at the Almaz Central Design Bureau under the leadership of Alexander Rasputin. The system entered Soviet service in November 1957. Each battery consisted of 6 launchers arranged in a hexagonal pattern that American photo interpreters came to call the flower, with the engagement radar at the center and the launchers at the 6 vertices. The fire control radar was designated the SNR-75, called the fan song in Western terminology. The missile itself stood 35 feet tall and weighed more than 2 tons at launch, its solid booster falling away seconds after ignition, while a liquid hypergolic sustainer drove it past the speed of sound toward its target. Its warhead was a 195-kilogram fragmentation device, designed to detonate in proximity rather than on contact, scattering thousands of metal fragments in a forward-expanding cone. Its maximum effective altitude was approximately 82,000 feet, 12,000 feet above the cruising altitude of a U-2. The first proof that the system could destroy a high-altitude aircraft did not come from the Soviet Union itself. It came from the People's Republic of China, which had received the system through technology transfer. On October 7, 1959, a Republic of China Air Force RB-57D Canberra reconnaissance aircraft, piloted by Captain Wang Yingqin. He was destroyed at 65,000 feet near Beijing by a salvo of 3 SA, 2 missiles fired by a Chinese-operated, Soviet-supplied battery. The destruction of Wang's aircraft was, although the world did not know it at the time, the first manned aircraft ever shot down by a surface-to-air missile in the history of warfare. The kill was attributed publicly to fighter aircraft to preserve the secret of the new weapon. The Soviet Union learned exactly what the system could do. But here was where the Soviet difficulty deepened rather than resolved. Building the missile system was one achievement. Deploying it where it would actually intercept an American intruder was another. By the spring of 1960, there were perhaps 80 to 150 operational S-2 batteries scattered across Soviet territory. The Soviet Union covered 8.5 million square miles. A U-2 crossing the country at 70,000 feet flew over an area in which 9 out of 10 geographic positions were not within the engagement envelope of any battery. Even when a battery was correctly positioned, the engagement window was narrow. The U-2 was slow, only about 450 miles an hour, but a battery had only seconds to acquire, lock, fire, and guide. Any failure in any link, the radar, the launcher, the fuse, the operator, meant the moment passed. And the Soviets knew, because they had tracked every American flight, that the moments had been passing for nearly 4 years. There was one further problem, technical and almost invisible. The U-2 carried a small electronic countermeasures box manufactured by the Granger Company, mounted in its tail. It was a deceptive jammer designed to confuse Soviet fighter control radars at close range. It was not tuned to the frequencies used by the Fan-Song missile guidance radar. American engineers had designed against the wrong threat. The Soviet missile system, when it found a U-2, would find it without electronic interference of any kind. This was a flaw the Americans did not know they had. They were about to learn. By April 1960, the Soviet capability to intercept a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft had matured to a brittle but real threshold. The SA-2 was deployed in increasing numbers around critical strategic targets. New high-altitude search radars, including the P-30 system that had entered service in 1959, were extending Soviet detection range into the deep interior. The Su-9 interceptor, although still inadequate against the U-2 in standard configuration, was being rushed into more units. A new air defense army had been formed at Sverdlovsk on April 10, 1960, just 21 days before the events that would test it. And Khrushchev, watching the American overflights continue, had passed his impatience down through the chain of command in language that left no one in doubt. The next intruder, he wanted understood, would not escape. The careers of his generals, perhaps even their lives, depended on it. What no one in the Kremlin knew, and what no one in Langley fully appreciated either, was that a final overflight had already been scheduled. President Eisenhower had set a deadline. Any further reconnaissance mission had to occur by May 1, 1960, after which the Paris Four Powers Summit would dominate the political calendar. 3 weather scrubs had pushed the mission to the very last day on Eisenhower's calendar. The aircraft was loaded, the pilot was sleeping in a barracks at Peshawar in Pakistan. And the new Soviet Air Defense Forces, under their 21-day-old new command, were preparing for a holiday parade in Red Square that featured, prominently displayed on transporter erectors rolling past Lenin's tomb, the very weapon that was about to enter combat. The mission carried the code name Operation Grand Slam. It was numbered 4154 in Central Intelligence Agency files, and it was assigned to the most experienced U-2 pilot in the program. Francis Gary Powers, born August 17, 1929, in the coal mining town of Jenkins, Kentucky, had flown F-84 Thunderjets in the United States Air Force before being recruited by the agency in January 1956. By 1960, he had completed 27 operational missions, more than any other pilot in the unit. He flew on a contract that paid him $30,000 a year, an enormous sum at the time. He carried no identification and no insignia. The unit to which he belonged, designated Detachment B, at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, operated under the cover designation of the 2nd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, Provisional, known internally as WRSP-2. Its true mission was photographic intelligence collection over the Soviet Union and its allies. The aircraft Powers was assigned that morning was a Lockheed U-2C, Article number 360, with the United States Air Force serial 566693. It wore the same dark sea blue scheme described above, a color that appeared near black at altitude or in monochrome film. It was equipped with the Hicon B camera, the Granger countermeasures box, and a 2.5-pound destruct charge designed to obliterate the camera and the airframe in case of compromise. The destruct charge had a 70-second delay between activation and detonation, a feature intended to give the pilot time to escape, contrary to later Soviet propaganda claims that it was a suicide device. Powers also carried, for the first time in his career, a hollow silver dollar that concealed a needle tipped with saxitoxin, a shellfish-derived poison that produced rapid paralysis and death. He carried it because he was permitted to use it if he chose. He was not required to. The flight plan was the most ambitious ever attempted. Powers would take off from a forward operating base at Peshawar, cross the Hindu Kush into Tajikistan, fly north over the Aral Sea, photograph the Tyuratam intercontinental ballistic missile range, continue past Magnitogorsk, photograph the Mayak plutonium production complex at Chelyabinsk, then turn over Sverdlovsk, photograph the suspected new missile site at Yuria, photograph the Plesetsk facility believed to be the first operational Soviet ICBM base, and finally recover at Bodo in northern Norway. The route was nearly 3,800 statute miles long. The flight would take approximately 9 hours. Powers had been awakened in his barracks at 2 a.m. Peshawar time. He had spent an hour breathing pure oxygen to purge nitrogen from his bloodstream. The takeoff signal arrived from the White House at 6:26 local time, which was 4:26 Moscow time. Powers rolled down the runway and lifted into the dawn. What follows is the morning as Soviet radar saw it. At approximately 5:30 Moscow time, Soviet air defense radar operators in the Central Asian sector detected an unidentified contact crossing the southern border at extreme altitude. The contact was tracked by a P-30 early warning radar, then handed off to a chain of P-12 and P-14 radars as it progressed northward. The detection report passed up the chain of command with extraordinary speed. By 6 a.m, Marshal Biryuzov was in the Central Command post in Moscow. By 7, the duty officer had alerted Defense Minister Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, who in turn telephoned Khrushchev. The Premier was preparing for the May Day parade. He gave a single instruction. The aircraft was not to escape. He then dressed for the reviewing stand on the Lenin Mausoleum and began the short drive to Red Square. Through the morning, Soviet fighter aircraft scrambled in successive waves and failed in successive waves. A pair of MiG-19s from the Tashkent area climbed to altitude and lost the contact in the haze. 2 Su-9s from Khanabad airfield in Uzbekistan, piloted by Captain Doroshenko and Lieutenant Kudlia, were ordered up too early, climbed instead of accelerating, and lost the contact entirely. At Sverdlovsk Koltsovo airfield, 2 factory-fresh Su-9s that were being ferried from Novosibirsk to a unit in Belarus had been weather-held over the holiday. The 2 pilots were Captain Anatoly Sakovich and Captain Igor Mentyukov. Sakovich went up first, attempted the intercept, exhausted his fuel, and made an emergency landing on the dirt strip at Troitsk. That left Mentyukov. The remaining Su-9 carried no air-to-air missiles. It was a ferry configuration airframe. Mentyukov himself was not wearing a high-altitude pressure suit because there was no operational expectation that he would be flying combat that day. Major General Yuri Vovk, commanding fighter operations at Sverdlovsk, conveyed the order from above. Mentyukov was to take off, climb to maximum altitude, and ram the American intruder. The order was issued by Colonel General Yevgeny Savitsky, the commander of Air Defense Aviation. Savitsky's radio call sign was Dragon. Mentyukov accepted the order and asked only that his pregnant wife and his mother be cared for if he did not return. Mentyukov took off at approximately 8:10 Moscow time. He pushed his Su-9 to nearly twice the speed of sound, pulled up sharply, and reached an altitude of about 68,000 feet. The U-2 was still 2,000 feet above him. Powers, on a planned 90-degree left, turn over Sverdlovsk to align his cameras with the city, drifted out of Mentyukov's intercept geometry. Mentyukov never saw the American aircraft visually. His ground controllers ordered him to disengage afterburner, which immediately cost him altitude, and he was vectored back to base. He landed at Koltsovo at 8:52 Moscow time, 1 minute before the missile that would actually kill the U-2 left its rail. The battery that fired that missile was the 2nd Battalion of the 57th Anti Aircraft Missile Brigade, sited in a clearing near the village of Kosulino, southeast of Sverdlovsk. The acting commander that morning was Major Mikhail Voronov. Because of the holiday, his unit was operating short-staffed. His radar operators acquired the U-2 on the Fansong engagement radar, switched to automatic tracking, computed a firing solution, and prepared a salvo of 3 missiles. Voronov gave the firing order. Of those 3, only 1 missile actually left its launcher. Different Russian sources have given different reasons. The official explanation cited a calculation that the target had passed beyond the optimal envelope. A later account, published in the post-Soviet period by the director of the Russian Air Defense Museum, suggested that in the chaos of the moment, the launch officer had simply forgotten to release the safety catch on the firing button for the 2nd and 3rd missiles. Whatever the reason, only 1 missile ascended into the morning sky over the Urals. Its solid booster fell away. Its sustainer engine ignited. It accelerated past the speed of sound and climbed toward the contrail of the American aircraft. At 8:53 Moscow time, the missile reached its target. It did not strike the U-2 directly. The proximity fuse in the warhead detected the aircraft as the missile passed beneath and behind it, and the fragmentation warhead detonated in close proximity to the tail of the aircraft, by most Russian accounts within several tens of meters. The shockwave and the fragmentation cone tore through the right horizontal stabilizer first, then through the wings, then through the tail. Inside the cockpit, Powers later reported, there was a dull thump, the aircraft jerked forward, and a tremendous orange flash filled the canopy. He said aloud the words, "My God, I have had it now." The right wing dropped away. The nose pitched down. The aircraft entered an inverted flat spin. The wings broke off entirely. What remained of the fuselage began to tumble toward the ploughed earth 12 miles below. What the Soviet radar operators saw at this moment was confusion. The single sharp target on the Fansong display dissolved into a cloud of returns as the wreckage scattered. Voronov did not initially report a kill because his operators could not interpret the cloud of secondary returns. The Sverdlovsk command post would not understand for another 30 to 40 minutes that the mission was already accomplished. Within those 40 minutes, the most dangerous chapter of the morning unfolded. A second pair of MiG-19s had been repositioned from Perm to Koltsovo earlier that morning. They were now airborne and returning to base. Their pilots were Captain Boris Iverzian, the deputy squadron commander, and his wingman, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, 30 years old, born in Gus-Krustalny in March 1930, a graduate of the Borisoglebsk Military Aviation School in 1952. The 2 MiGs, completely unaware that the U-2 had already been destroyed, flew through the same airspace where the engagement had occurred. At a separate S, a 2 battery sited at Monetny, northwest of Sverdlovsk, commanded by Captain Nikolai Shalutko, radar operators acquired what they interpreted as a target at 36,000 feet. Shalutko queried the district command post. He was told that no Soviet aircraft were airborne. The identification friend or foe transponders on the MiG-19s were still set to the April code, because in the rush of the holiday, the May code change had been overlooked. The friend or foe interrogator on Shalutko's radar registered the MiGs as hostile. Shalutko fired 3 missiles. 1 missile detonated near Senior Lieutenant Safronov's MiG-19 at 9:23 Moscow time, killing him. His aircraft fell into a public park in the town of Degtyarsk, west of Sverdlovsk. Captain Iverzian, seeing the missile trails, executed a violent vertical dive from approximately 33,000 feet to nearly the deck, evading the remaining missiles by a maneuver that pilots later called impossible. He landed at Koltsovo with a bent airframe and a story that was suppressed for 30 years. Senior Lieutenant Safronov's death was hidden from the Soviet public and largely from the Soviet military until the era of Glasnost. His widow was told only that he had died on duty. The decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, signed by Leonid Brezhnev on May 7, 1960, awarded Safronov the Order of the Red Banner, without the word posthumously. The same decree decorated Major Voronov for the destruction of the American intruder and Captain Shalutko for engaging the supposed second intruder. Russian language accounts disagree about which specific battery fired the lethal salvo, but the official record of the day, embodied in that decree, stands. The friendly fire had been buried inside it. Powers, meanwhile, was tumbling helplessly through the upper atmosphere inside what was left of his cockpit. The aircraft had lost cabin pressure. His partial pressure suit had inflated automatically, immobilizing his arms and legs. Centrifugal force pinned him forward against the canopy. He tried to reach the ejection seat handle, then realized that ejecting in this attitude would shear off his legs above the knee against the canopy rail, because the U-2 ejection system did not retract the limbs before firing. He chose to bail out manually. He flipped up the safety covers on the destruct switches, but, thrown against the canopy by the spin, he could not reach the toggle switches themselves. He jettisoned the canopy at approximately 34,000 feet. He released his seatbelt. He was sucked out of the aircraft, then pulled up short by his oxygen hoses, which he had forgotten to disconnect. The hoses tore loose. His parachute opened automatically at 15,000 feet, triggered by a barostatic switch. He landed in a ploughed field near the village of Kosulino. 2 collective farm workers ran across the furrows and reached him before he could even gather his parachute. They turned him over to local militia within minutes. By nightfall, he was in Lubyanka prison in central Moscow. The poison needle was in his pocket. He had not used it. Soviet recovery teams collected the wreckage of the U-2 over the following days. The Haikon B camera was recovered intact, with its film exposed across the Tyuratam range, the Mayak nuclear complex, and the city of Sverdlovsk itself. Engineers extracted the Granger countermeasures box, the survival kit, and the 7,500 Soviet rubles in compromise currency that Powers had been carrying, the 2 watches, the 2 rings, and the silver dollar with its hidden needle. The principal artifacts were placed on public exhibition at Gorky Park in Moscow on May 11, 1960, the same site where the Soviets had displayed captured German military equipment in 1945. Khrushchev personally toured the exhibition with foreign correspondents. What followed in Washington was a cascade of misjudgment that became, in its way, almost as historically consequential as the shootdown itself. On May 5, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, acting on a cover story prepared in advance, announced that one of its weather research aircraft had gone missing over Lake Van in eastern Turkey after the pilot reported oxygen difficulties. That same day, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet and announced that an American aircraft had been shot down over Soviet territory. He deliberately did not mention that the pilot was alive. The Eisenhower administration, believing the pilot was dead and the destruct charge had functioned, doubled down on the cover story. On May 6, the State Department issued a press release reiterating the weather research narrative. A U-2 was painted in NASA livery and shown to reporters at the agency's Flight Research Center in California to support the lie. On May 7th, Khrushchev sprang the trap. Standing again before the Supreme Soviet, he announced that he had to tell them a secret, that when he had made his first report, he had deliberately not said that the pilot was alive, and that the pilot had been captured and was being interrogated. He read aloud excerpts of Powers' early statements. He displayed photographs of the recovered wreckage. The American cover story collapsed in a single afternoon. On May 9, Secretary of State Christian Herter conceded that the United States had been conducting reconnaissance flights since the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. On May 11, Eisenhower himself faced a press conference and personally took responsibility, calling intelligence collection a distasteful but vital necessity, invoking the memory of Pearl Harbor, and refusing to apologize. It was the first time in modern history that a head of state had publicly admitted, in his own voice, to peacetime espionage against another sovereign nation. The Paris Four Powers Summit convened on May 16 at the Élysée Palace. Khrushchev had given the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan a written demand the day before. Eisenhower must condemn the overflights, renounce future overflights, and publicly punish those responsible. At the opening session, after a brief introduction by President Charles de Gaulle of France, Khrushchev seized the floor and read a prepared denunciation. Eisenhower replied that overflights had already been suspended for the duration of his administration, but he refused to apologize. Khrushchev publicly withdrew his standing invitation for Eisenhower's reciprocal state visit, originally planned for June 1960. By the following day, the summit had collapsed entirely. The disarmament negotiations at Geneva broke off at the end of June. The nuclear test ban talks stalled. The careful, fragile thaw that journalists had called the spirit of Camp David had, in the space of 2 weeks, simply ceased to exist. Powers stood trial in the Hall of Columns of the House of the Unions in central Moscow from August 17 to August 19, 1960. The presiding judge was Lieutenant General Viktor Borisoglebsky of the Military Collegium of the USSR Supreme Court. The prosecutor was Roman Rudenko, the Procurator General of the Soviet Union, who had served as the Soviet chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 46. The trial began on Powers' 31st birthday. He was convicted of espionage and sentenced on August 19 to 10 years of deprivation of liberty, 3 in prison and 7 in a labor colony. He was held briefly at Lubyanka, then transferred in September to Vladimir Central Prison, the historic Russian penal facility about 100 miles northeast of Moscow. His cellmate at Vladimir was Zygmunt Kruminj, a Latvian political prisoner serving 25 years for anti-Soviet activities. According to a document obtained by Powers' son in the years after the publication of his book Spy Pilot, Kruminj had agreed in advance to inform on Powers in exchange for a lighter sentence of his own. Despite this, the two men became genuine friends. Kruminj taught Powers chess and the traditional Latvian craft of rug weaving and encouraged him to keep a journal. Powers wove 3 rugs during his imprisonment. One of them is held today by the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Powers' freedom came on the morning of February 10, 1962, on the Glienicke Bridge, spanning the Havel River between West Berlin and the city of Potsdam in East Germany. The bridge had been chosen precisely because it formed the boundary between the American sector and the Soviet sector, and a transfer at its centerline could be conducted simultaneously by both sides, without either crossing into the other's jurisdiction. The American negotiator was James Donovan, a New York attorney who had served as general counsel of the Office of Strategic Services and as an associate prosecutor at Nuremberg. Donovan had previously served as court-appointed defense counsel for the man being exchanged for Powers, the Soviet illegal officer William Fischer, who had operated in the United States under the cover name Rudolf Abel. At Abel's 1957 trial, Donovan had persuaded the judge to spare Abel from execution, arguing that an American of equivalent rank might one day be captured and need to be exchanged. His argument had now come true. The exchange itself took 20 minutes longer than scheduled, because the East German authorities deliberately delayed the parallel release of an American student named Frederick Pryor, held in East Berlin on trumped-up charges, at Checkpoint Charlie about 15 miles away. At 8:45 Berlin time, word reached the bridge that Pryor had been delivered. At 8:52, Powers and Abel walked past each other at the white line in the center of the span. Each man entered his own country. Neither one looked back. 3 months and 17 days after Powers' aircraft fell, the consequences of his shootdown began to reshape the strategic order in ways that the men who had fired the missile at Kosulino could not have imagined. On August 18, 1960, an Air Force Thor Agena rocket lifted off from Vandenberg Air Base in California, carrying a satellite designated Discoverer 14. Aboard was a panoramic camera designated Keyhole 1. The satellite completed 17 orbits of the Earth, photographed Soviet territory across hundreds of thousands of square miles on 7 passes over denied airspace, and ejected its film capsule on August 19. The capsule descended by parachute over the Pacific Ocean, 360 miles southwest of Honolulu. A C-119 cargo aircraft of the 6593rd Test Squadron snagged it in mid-air at 8,000 feet altitude. The single mission returned more photographic coverage of Soviet territory than every U-2 overflight from 1956 to 1960 combined. This was the program known as Corona, run jointly by the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Air Force under the public cover designation Discoverer. It had begun in 1958 and had failed 12 consecutive times. The 13th flight returned a capsule with no camera, the first man-made object recovered from orbit. The 14th, 3 months after Sverdlovsk, returned the first satellite imagery of the Soviet Union. By September 1961, Corona photography had compelled American intelligence to revise its estimate of the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile force from over 140 operational launchers to between 10 and 25. The actual figure that summer was 4. The missile gap that had haunted American policy for half a decade had not merely closed, it had reversed. The Soviet Union had been overflown not from 70,000 feet, but from 100 miles above, and there was nothing any surface-to-air missile in the world could do about it. Eisenhower never authorized another manned overflight of the Soviet Union. The U-2 continued to operate in other theaters, over China with Republic of China Air Force pilots, over Cuba in the autumn of 1962, over North Vietnam later in the decade. Major Rudolph Anderson of the 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing became the first American pilot killed by a surface-to-air missile in combat when his U-2 was destroyed by an S.A-2 over Baines, Cuba, on October 27, 1962, the most dangerous day of the missile crisis. The Soviet officers who fired on him had acted without authorization from Moscow. The SA-2 became the most widely exported air defense system in history, deployed by approximately 35 countries. North Vietnamese batteries equipped with the same weapon that had killed the U-2 at Sverdlovsk shot down their first American aircraft, an Air Force F-4C Phantom, on July 24, 1965, and the American counter-response, the Wild Weasel program of dedicated radar suppression aircraft, achieved its first kill that December. The competition between radar-guided missiles and the aircraft they targeted, born in the rivalry between Lockheed and the Almaz Design Bureau, would continue for the remainder of the Cold War. The strategic importance of the Powers incident lies finally in what it accelerated. American reconnaissance moved into space and stayed there. The Central Intelligence Agency established a Directorate of Science and Technology in 1962, primarily to manage the satellite reconnaissance enterprise. The National Reconnaissance Office was created in secret in September 1961 to coordinate the joint civilian and military satellite programs. The framework Eisenhower had attempted to establish at Geneva in 1955, his Open Skies proposal, was rejected by Khrushchev only to be invented by other means. By 1972, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty would explicitly rely on what its language called National Technical Means of Verification, a phrase that meant satellites, the direct descendants of the program that Sverdlovsk had forced into existence. The men who had been at Kosulino on the morning of May 1, 1960, lived their later lives in the strange shadow of a moment whose meaning kept shifting. Major Mikhail Voronov accepted the Order of the Red Banner from Marshal Beryozov, served his career out in the Air Defense Forces, and died in the early post-Soviet years. Captain Igor Mentyukov, who had launched in an unarmed Su-9 to ram an aircraft he could not see, gave a long interview to the Russian newspaper Trud in October 1996 in which he claimed his aircraft's wake turbulence had broken up the U-2. Western and Russian aviation historians have rejected the claim, citing the geometric impossibility of wake interaction at the altitudes and separation involved, but Mentyukov maintained his account until his death. The widow of Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, Anna Vasilievna Panfilova, later married Captain Boris Ivazyan, the flight leader who had survived Captain Sheludko's missiles by diving from the stratosphere to the deck. The town of Degtyarsk, where Safronov fell, named a memorial park after him. On May 1, 2007, a stele was dedicated at his old airfield. On May 1, 2010, a MiG-31 of his old regiment was named in his honor. Francis Gary Powers returned to a country that did not entirely know what to do with him. He testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on March 6, 1962, using a wooden model of the U-2 with detachable wings to demonstrate how his aircraft had broken apart. The committee found that he had lived up to the terms of his employment and his obligations as an American. He worked as a U-2 test pilot for Lockheed at the Skunk Works in Burbank from 1963 to 1970. He published his memoir, called Operation Overflight, in 1970. He flew helicopters for Los Angeles television station KNBC from 1976 until his death. On August 1, 1977, his Bell 206 Jet Ranger ran out of fuel returning from filming brush fires in Santa Barbara County and crashed in the Sepulveda Dam Basin in suburban Los Angeles. He was 47 years old, He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The United States Air Force had quietly approved a Distinguished Flying Cross for him in 1986, 9 years after his death. In 2000, the medal was formally presented to his family, along with the Prisoner of War Medal and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency Medal. In 2012, the United States Air Force awarded him the Silver Star, presented to his grandchildren at the Pentagon. The citation honored his gallantry from May 1, 1960, to February 10, 1962. What the Soviet radar crews saw on that morning, in the end, was not simply an aircraft falling. They saw the closing of a particular kind of asymmetry. For 4 years, the United States had enjoyed something approaching aerial impunity over the Soviet Union, an ability to inspect a closed society at will. That ability had rested on a single technical fact, the altitude of the U-2, and on a single political fact, the willingness of an American president to authorize the inspections in person. Both facts ended on May 1. The technical advantage was overcome by Soviet missile development. The political tolerance was exhausted by Eisenhower's public admission and by the diplomatic catastrophe that followed. But what the radar crews could not see, what no one in the Soviet Union saw clearly until decades later, was that the same morning closed one asymmetry while opening another. The American capability to photograph Soviet territory did not vanish. It simply rose another 15 miles, into orbits where no SA-2 could reach and no Soviet pilot could ram. Within 3 months, a single American satellite had photographed more Soviet ground than every previous U-2 mission combined. Within a year, the entire framework of American intelligence about Soviet strategic forces had been rebuilt around overhead reconnaissance, of a kind that no air defense system on Earth could oppose. The Soviets had won the battle. They had not won the war. They had, in a sense they did not yet appreciate, only succeeded in driving their adversary into a domain where the Soviet Union could not compete on equal terms. The deeper meaning of the power's shootdown is therefore not the destruction of an aircraft. It is the inadvertent acceleration of a transition that both superpowers, in their different ways, had been resisting. Verifiable arms control became possible only because satellite reconnaissance made unilateral inspection unstoppable. The treaties that bounded the nuclear arsenals of the late Cold War, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreements of the 1970s, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 1991, all rested on a verification architecture that had been forced into being by the morning over Sverdlovsk. The closed society could no longer remain closed. The price of secrecy had become the certainty of being seen. For the men who fired the missile, this larger meaning was invisible, and probably would have seemed irrelevant. Their war was the immediate one. Their adversary was the silent, dark blue aircraft that had crossed their country 23 times before, and that, on a single bright Sunday morning, did not cross it again. They had done what their premier had ordered. They had ended the impunity. On May 1, 1960, the Soviet Air Defense Forces ceased to be a humiliated branch of a humiliated system and became, however briefly, the most successful air defense force in the world. The moment did not last. It did not need to. It happened once, in full view of a watching world, and it changed what the rest of the Cold War would look like.